All right, let's talk about some more stuff about the nervous system. Or this part of the lecture, or this lecture rather, is where we take this neuron that we learned a lot about in our first lecture on the nervous system, and we take it and we say, how does this one single cell that's directional, that takes in a signal, a chemical signal, converts it to an electrical signal, which then converts back to a chemical signal, how does that then apply to the entire body? And so that's what we're going to do with this lecture. So the first thing to realize is that I think we all very much appreciate that the nervous system is very complicated, but we can break it down into certain parts, so into some very discrete parts. We have the central nervous system and then the peripheral nervous system. And the central nervous system is just the brain and the spinal cord. These two, so the brain is, we can classify these this way because these are integrating regions. They integrate signals, they take in sensory signals, they integrate what they're perceiving, and then they send out the action signals, the motor signals, whereas the peripheral nervous system is what sends the messages to the nervous system, the central nervous system, and then what carries out the messages that are coming from it. So we can actually break that down into two more parts. We have the somatic nervous system, and that's all the voluntary stuff like your muscles, and it also is your sensory system that sends signals to the central nervous system. And then we have the autonomic nervous system, which is all the involuntary bodily functions. And there's actually some people add a third category, which is the enteric nervous system or the gastric nervous system. Both of those refer to kind of a specific subset of the neurons that are all involved in the guts, but people are still trying to figure out what's happening with that, so we're not going to cover that in this class. But we can look at the autonomic nervous system, and if you're kind of wondering, how do I remember somatic versus autonomic? Well, somatic is soma, it means body, like we learned in the last lecture. The soma of the neuron is the cell body. Autonomic sounds a lot like automatic, so it's your automatic systems that you don't have to think about because they're involuntary. And we can actually break those down into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And I've heard people refer to these as, so the sympathetic nervous system is your stress system, it's your fight or flight system. It arouses the body to expend energy because something's happening and you have to deal with it. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is when everything's calm, you can conserve energy, you can maintain energy, you can use energy to grow, to reproduce, to do all these chill things. So if this is the fight or flight system, the sympathetic nervous system, then this is the rest and digest system. And there's actually a lot more to fight or flight than just fighting and fleeing your way out of a situation. A lot of organisms and a lot of people, instead of doing fight or flight, will do freeze, and it's just a very natural reaction. It doesn't help you in certain situations, but it's nothing, people do it. It's not a bad thing. But yeah, we'll get into that later when we get to the endocrine system, but it is very important to remember that the sympathetic nervous system is the one that's trying to get you out of bad situations, and the parasympathetic nervous system is just helping you deal with everyday normal situations like digestion and that kind of thing. We'll get into these two a lot more later, but these will come up again. Okay, so that's just how we organize the system. We have the processing part, and then we have the action part. So we talked about the neurons already. That's the main cell of the nervous system, the action cell of the nervous system. But there's actually a whole lot of other stuff. Before we can even talk about the brain at all, we have to talk about neuroglia, reflex arcs, which we've talked about a little bit, the meninges, which we've talked about a little bit in lab. We'll talk a little bit about ventricles and cerebrospinal fluid, and then we can start talking about the brain. And unfortunately, in this class, we don't go into the brain in any super great detail because it's so complicated. You will go into it in more detail in more advanced anatomy classes. So let's talk about the neuroglia, the neuroglial cells. So the neuroglial cells are the accessory cells that exist in the brain to help the neurons function. So only 10% of nervous tissue is even neurons at all. There is no connective tissue, so there's nothing in there just kind of filling in space to hold things in place. But there is 90% of the nervous system is this neuroglial system. So these are the cells that are there just to support the neurons, to make sure signals are being used properly, that the neurons are being fed properly, that everything is the whole system can function, because all of these different cells that we see here, the oligodendrocyte, the astrocyte, the epidermal cell, the microglial cell, all these guys are just here to help support the neuron, to make sure that signals are being propagated without any problem. So what do these things do? So we've already kind of talked about the Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system make myelin, and they create this sheath. In the central nervous system, instead of having one cell for each sheath, we have what's called the oligodendrocyte, and it has actually one central cell that sends out these weird sheath things that go and surround the axon, and it sends out several at once. So not only does it encapsulate that axon to keep the signal pure, it also kind of holds the system together a little bit, which is good, so stuff doesn't kind of wander off. We also see phagocytes, so the nervous system has its own system of these microglial cells that go around and make sure there's no dead cells clogging up the works, there's no bacteria or viruses or fungus or anything that needs to be taken care of. Basically, the nervous system has its own security system. We know that there are a lot of capillaries and other kinds of neuroglial cells that are aligning the capillaries so that they can take in information and nutrients, etc. And they regulate the environment. They create this thing called the blood-brain barrier, which is really important. This is so all of the blood vessels that actually enter your brain have to be very carefully filtered, because you don't want you could have all sorts of weird toxins and stuff in your blood. Your brain needs to stay as clean as possible to be fully functional, and so the blood-brain barrier makes sure no weird hormones or toxins or bacteria or whatever can actually make it through that barrier and get into the brain. So it's really, really important. One interesting fact about the blood-brain barrier is that so steroids can get through a lot of barriers because they're lipid-based. They can pass through anything that's made of lipids, like a cell membrane or the blood-brain barrier. Whenever you have a medication that you're concerned that it might go to the brain and have a funny action, you make it so that it can pass that blood-brain barrier, so it can't be a steroid. But we make a lot of natural steroids, and it turns out that estrogen actually estrogen masculinizes the brain. And so in order for a male fetus to have a male brain, you have to have a wash of estrogen go through the brain and then activate certain parts of it to become masculine. But what if you're a female fetus and you're hanging out in a female mother? Okay, so you're being developed in a female womb. There are no male wombs. So what happens then? You're washed in estrogen all the time. Well, that estrogen is soaked up in the bloodstream of the fetus by fetal alpha proteins is what they're called. And so they bind to that estrogen and make it too big to pass through the blood-brain barrier. Because if the estrogen in a female fetus gets into the brain, it masculinizes the brain. This may explain cases of transgender individuals where they have a male body but a female brain because they have malfunctioning estrogen, or maybe they have the presence of alpha fetoproteins that shouldn't be there, or a female body with a male brain where for some reason estrogen got into the brain and masculinized it even though the fetus was female. So this blood-brain barrier is really important, and when it doesn't function, there's so many things that can then change in the brain. They can affect the brain in lots and lots of different ways. And it's there's a lot of neuroglial cells that do this just to make sure they're just guarding the system, basically. We know that the neuroglial cell, so basically a neuroglial cell is just a supporting cell of the nervous system. They do things like, some other things they do are they support the neuron body, so they just create, that's what this oligodendrocyte is doing, is just holding it in place. That's what this astrocyte is doing, is holding this in place close to a capillary, close to other neurons. And they make cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid is just the fluid that flows in the brain and the spine. And it's very important. There's been a lot of evidence showing that Alzheimer's may be due to cerebrospinal fluid not being flushed out regularly, and that happens when you sleep. And so it's really important. There's so much evidence now saying that getting regular sleep is just so important to warding off dementia and Alzheimer's. So, let's all get enough sleep, because that's super easy. Okay, so this, make sure you know all the various different functions that these things do. The only thing that a neural glial cell does not do is propagate an action potential. So the only cells that propagate an action potential are the actual neurons. Okay, so the neuron can propagate an action potential or an electric signal. The glial cells can't. They're just hanging out, helping out the neurons. That's it. So we've talked a lot about this, the reflex arc, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. So a reflex arc or any kind of simple neural circuit is so the reflex arc is a pathway that does not get processed by the brain. So this is a cross section of the spinal cord looking down into it. And what's happening is if you have a stimulus that hits the right nerve and you hit that right sensory neuron and its track leads directly to this reflex arc, and there's only one outcome that can happen. So then it gets to that reflex arc, it's got enough of a signal to propagate the action potential, and then it goes right back and connects to a motor neuron, which makes something happen, and that's a reflex. Okay, so you have a receptor. So some receptor, in this case, it's the nerve at the patellar ligament. There's a sensory neuron there that takes in information. There may or may not be an interneuron in that loop here. And then it sends and it says, yes, I've had enough signal, make that sensory or make that motor neuron act. And so there's only one action that can happen, and that's happening through the effector. So the effector is the muscle that's causing something to happen. Okay, so we talked a little bit about, let's see. So these can be something somatic or autonomic. So somatic is going to be something voluntary. So this is a voluntary muscle that's being affected when you have that kick reflex, the patellar reflex, when you hit the knee and you kick out. But there's autonomic things, like if you're cold, then you have an involuntary response that makes you shiver or go someplace warmer. We aren't going to worry about this part about the axonal, bineuronal, etc. We'll just keep going. But the important thing is that you have a receptor, which is whatever's taking in the signal. That receptor tells the sensory neuron, hey, this happened. And if it's enough of a signal, the sensory neuron then sends that signal to the spinal cord, to that reflex arc. It sends a signal back to the motor neuron saying, do something. And then the effector is the muscle that carries out that action. All right. So in that process, when we have sensory receptor cells, that cell, this kind of is just looking at this from another angle, an afferent or sensory neuron takes sensory information to the brain. So something happens to a receptor, it detects something, and when it does that, the sensory neuron goes, huh, I better report that. So that's two different things. So you have this receptor cell, like your skin cells, detecting pressure, okay? The sensory neuron is like, hey, something's touching me. I better tell the interneurons so they can process it. And if it's something that is part of a reflex, then it's just going to immediately go through the spine and go straight back to that motor neuron. And then that motor neuron is going to cause a muscle or a gland to do something, okay? So if you are a sensory receptor cell in the nose, let's say, and you smell, let's say you're a wild sheep, okay, and you smell it, this receptor cell in the nose smells the scent of a beautiful wild sheep lady who's just ready to make babies. Well, the sensory neuron takes that information, the affector neuron takes that information, and it goes to the this shouldn't say interneural, I bet. Neural. I don't know what that is. The interneuron. All right, we'll just let it be whatever it was. It takes that information and it says, hey, something's happening. You may not even realize you're processing this, but we're going to what I want you to do, and it sends the information, that it commands through the motor neuron to do something. So it could send a signal saying, turn and face the beautiful lady sheep that's releasing that pheromone that you like so much. Or it could release a signal to a gland that says, release testosterone because we should make a baby sheep with this sheep. Whatever it is, it's always this process. You detect something, your sensory neurons report it, your interneurons, or if it's not a reflex, your brain processes this, and then you send out a command through the motor neurons, but then the neuron itself doesn't do a thing. It just sends a signal. So it sends the signal to a muscle or a gland to do something. So that's really important to remember. So the affector is what takes in information. The effector is what does something. All right. So, why do we even need reflexes? These are things that have to happen so quickly that and it's always the same response that there's no reason to involve the brain, and it's to protect yourself. So originally the slide had a nail on it, but I think we're much more likely to step on Legos in this day and age than nails. So if you are walking barefoot and you step on something and it hits a certain nerve in your foot, that's going to send a signal immediately through the spinal cord to say, hey, flex your foot because you're stepping on something bad and it's really going to hurt you, and then you're not going to be able to hunt for your gazelles and survive in the savannah because our brain still thinks that we haven't evolved past just living on the savannah and worrying about lions. So you have this immediate response. There's no reason for your brain to like step on a Lego and think about it and be like, should I move my foot? It's kind of, no, you have this immediate reflex to pop up off of that Lego, so you're no longer, those sensory neurons are no longer taking in that information. So the fact that the reflexes go through the spine and they only have one response is very, very fast compared to going through the brain. Let's see. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the peripheral nervous system. So in the peripheral nervous system, what's happening is you have nerves from, let's see, how do we go to process this? So if this is a motor neuron, the motor neurons are all going to come from the spine, okay? So they come from the spine and then they go and they synapse on muscles, let's say. So in the somatic motor neurons, or the somatic nervous system, this is all voluntary muscles. And so all of these neurons are going to go and end up on voluntary muscles, those skeletal muscles that we talked about that have a neuromuscular junction. You release that acetylcholine onto that muscle. We talked all about that. We are all experts in it, I hope. And that's the only action that happens is a contraction of your muscle, and you can totally control this. You don't, however, control, let's see, skeletal muscle of carcass, always excitatory. I don't know why this says carcass, that's all right. It's basically a one-cell system. You have one neuron, it goes, it synapses on a muscle, and you're done, okay? You don't, however, have control of your glands. You don't sit here and think, you know what I really want to do today? Release all the insulin. And thank goodness, because it's hard enough just like remembering to take out the trash. But if you'd have to remember to take out like your insulin when you needed it, we would all be dead. Okay? So unless, people who have diabetes know you have to remember these things, and that's just one hormone that you have to manage. So the autonomic nervous system takes care of this all for us. And it's much more complicated. It's an involuntary system. A lot of it acts in the guts or the viscera. It can be excitatory or inhibitory. So it could be, whereas in the motor neuron system, it's always excitatory. You're always contracting a muscle, and that's it. You're either contracting it or you're no longer signaling it. In the case of the autonomic, you're either causing something to happen or causing something to turn off. It's not just a one-way system. So it could be something where you have let's see, if you're like, let's say, causing your heart to beat, okay? So you have this motor neuron leaving the spinal cord, it goes, it probably has several neurons that it goes through, and then it releases ACH or norepinephrine onto a heart cell, and it's releasing, and if it's norepinephrine, you could be affecting how fast your heart is beating. ACH is just, the acetylcholine is just telling it to beat. And so this is it's a two-cell system, basically. You have to have the motor neuron and an interneuron that's happening. It's more complicated. The autonomic system is more complicated, but that's good because you need to have a lot of checks and balances to make sure it's working properly. Let's keep going. Okay, so that's some basic neuron stuff. Let's talk, so we talked about the neuroglia, we talked about some peripheral versus central nervous system. Let's talk about the meninges. So the meninges are just these three protective layers of tissue around the brain and the spinal cord. And so they're they're all Latin names, and they're kind of silly. They're interesting names. So the dura mater is let's say you have a brain, you're looking down, you're peeling the layers off of a brain. So you've peeled off the skin layer and the fat layer underneath that, and this is the skull. As soon as you take the skull away, you hit, there's a little bit of fluid, and then you hit this dura mater. So the dura mater means tough mother, and it's our toughest meninges, and it just is a protective layer. And between that And the next one is the space called the subdural space. So subdural means under the dura. So subdural makes sense. And that's where a lot of blood is. And it's basically, that's where your blood vessels can release blood to then be taken up by the arachnoid mater, which means spiderweb mother or spider mother, because when the Romans and whoever was first looking at this were looking, they'd chop into someone's head, they'd see this very spiderweb looking filament. And so they called it arachnoid because it looks like spiderweb. And so what that does is it pulls, so between A and B here, we have a layer of blood. And whatever the brain needs, the arachnoid matter can pull from that blood. And between B and C, you have the subarachnoid space. So it's the space under the arachnoid that's full of cerebrospinal fluid. So any of the fluid or materials that was needed from the blood that sits between A and B gets pulled into the cerebrospinal fluid, which sits between B and C in the subarachnoid space. C is, you can barely see it on here, but it's called the pia mater, which means the delicate mother, and it's the finest layer. It's just an added extra layer of protection for your brain, and it allows the movement of the cerebrospinal fluid onto the brain. And we're going to talk a bit more about what happens then. But first, the meninges extend through to the spinal cord. So it's the same thing here. It's the same tissues. It's just they kind of come together on the spine also. So you still have the same order. The dura mater is on the outside, the arachnoid mater is in the middle, and the pia mater is on the very inside. And in between each one, you have so between the dura mater and the arachnoid is cerebrospinal fluid. Between the arachnoid and the pia is your between the dura and the arachnoid is the blood system. Between the arachnoid and the pia is the cerebral spinal fluid. So you may have heard of people having to get a spinal tap. So what a spinal tap is when you take a very large needle and you put it in, you have to go through the dura mater and then through the arachnoid mater and then hit just right between the arachnoid and the pia mater and pull out some fluid in order to test for nerve damage or broken cells or whatever it is you're looking for. Incredibly painful because this is all just straight up neurons. That's all this is. And so you're interfering, you're basically kicking those, you're stimulating them a bunch. And there's a lot of pain involved. So it's not a pleasant process. Okay, so let's talk about the brain. There's so much we could talk about. The brain is so interesting and strange, and we just barely know anything about it. We're just going to kind of briefly hit a bunch of parts. So first of all, let's talk about how we have what's called the forebrain. So that's all of this. We have the midbrain and the hindbrain, and it kind of gets more complicated as you go up. So the hindbrain takes care of very, very simple things. Well, not simple. The very, very essential things that you need to be a living organism, okay? So the hindbrain contains the pons, the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata. So this is the pons, this is the medulla, and this is the cerebellum. And all these things do is they take care of breathing and standing upright and the vomit response and just things that every animal could do. Some animals can't vomit, so they don't have that part of the brain. But all animals need a beating heart. All animals need a good blood system, etc., etc. And that is what any animal with a brain, that's what the hindbrain takes care of. So the midbrain it's slightly more complicated. It takes care of some sight and sound control. It deals with eye motion. It deals with the cerebral arousal. So how active, it's really, when you're in a coma, the midbrain gets damaged. The midbrain is really inactive during sleep. So all we really know is that part of what we know, that all we care about for this class, is that it's involved in cerebral arousal. So if you are awake, the midbrain is active. So you may have heard, oh, we only use 10% of our brain, and that is nonsense. That's 100% false. We use our entire brain. We just use it at different times. So the idea of the whole 10% of our brain thing came from scientists wanting to see how little brain you could survive on. And so they tested on lab rats. And what they did is they just started chipping away, like just poking rat brains and scrambling them up and like just seeing how much of the brain they could destroy in live rats before the rat died. And so you got to think that's not a good analog for humans. So what they found is the rat would not be dead if they still had 10% of their brain function. but they weren't moving, they weren't eating, they weren't doing anything. They were just alive, barely. And then they don't tell you how long they were alive. So it's horrible. And so the idea that humans only use 10% of their brain, and there's drugs out there that can open up more of your brain, that's nonsense. Don't click on any link that tells you this drug will help you activate more of your brain. No, that's super nonsense. There are parts of our brain that are only active when we're sleeping. There's parts of our brain that are only active when we're awake, but we use all of our brain tissue. The body is too lazy to have anything to keep anything that it doesn't need. Okay, let's move on. Brains are super interesting. Oh man, brains I think are very interesting. If you look at a whole brain in the human, oh well, let's go back up a second. So the forebrain, I didn't talk about the forebrain. So the forebrain is the much more complicated stuff. It contains the thalamus, which takes the sensory information coming in from all parts of your brain and then sends it to other regions that need it. The hypothalamus is this control center of the brain that takes in sensory information and then sends hormone signals to the rest of the body just to keep everything organized by hormones. Super important. Let's talk about the corpus callosum first, which is in this region. This is a bundle of neurons that keep the two sides of the brain in contact and in communication. So very important. A lot of disorders involve partial lobotomies involve no, not partial lobotomies. What am I thinking of? There are processes where you go in and you cut the corpus callosum so that your brain regions aren't talking to each other. And in those cases, you can cover one eye and suddenly you have no idea what's happening to the other side of your body. It's very strange and complicated. The cerebellum, on the other hand, that is this huge part, and it is basically, a lot of this is how we think of as being human. This involves the limbic system. So the limbic system is all in this part of the brain, and it is our emotions, our expression, our attitude, our personality. This is a part of the brain that when people thought lobotomies were a good idea, this is a part of the brain they were destroying. So in the era of American culture where people like to say that autism is a recent event. Oh, it's only happened recently. But the truth is there's always been autism. It's just that people were really embarrassed by it, and they would send their children who had autism away to asylums, like insane asylums, because the idea was clearly you failed as a parent if you have an autistic child. Send them to the asylum and then never speak about them again. Horrible, horrible time, right? So horrible. And so basically they were sending kids off to prisons, to these institutions where they had no idea what kind of kids they were dealing with. They just knew, if we don't have to think about them or see them, then that's fine. And so people tried to cure people who had autism or mental illness or just any kind of behavior that was not seen as proper in lots of horrible ways, like electroshock therapy that was very ineffective, and then lobotomies, which is where you would take basically an ice pick and shove it into this part of the brain and then just shake it around. And then when the person comes out of the lobotomy, suddenly they don't have that horrible behavior that they had. They don't have whatever the tick they had that was there before. They don't speak their minds anymore, because the part of the brain that really is you and is your personality is in this forebrain part, the prefrontal cortex. So if you were to go in and start decimating all of those neurons, of course you're not going to be the same person you were before, because you've literally destroyed all of the personality neurons. And half those people died horribly. And so it took years, but people finally realized, lobotomies are horrible, and now nobody does them because they are horrible. Okay, rant over. Let's look at, what do you see when you look at a whole brain? So I think it's really interesting to look at the brains of different animals, because you can definitely see what is more important to them. So in the human brain versus the cat brain, you can see, so the cats have this thing that's up here that we don't. We kind of sort of, but we have this huge cerebellum compared to a cat brain. And I love cats. I think they're awesome. But if you were to compare just looking at this, what do humans do that cats don't? There's definitely a lot more of the sensory processing parts of the brain in the human, but the cats have an amazing sense of smell, and that's what this are the olfactory bulbs, which we are almost completely missing because we barely have a sense of smell. If you look at these two brains, they're also very interesting. This is actually a dolphin brain and a shark brain. This is a hammerhead shark, and It's interesting. They don't have a lot of cerebellum. There's not a lot of thinking going on in a shark, but they, sorry, cerebellum, that is not cerebrum like I'm thinking it is. Let me make sure I'm not lying. Da-da-da. Yeah, so the cerebellum is involved in just processing normal things. In the case of a fish, you're worried about buoyancy and salinity control and all these things. But they have these huge olfactory tracts because they rely almost entirely on smell. So they have huge olfactory bulbs. In the case of the dolphin, you see this very huge cerebellum that looks it's almost like two human brains put together. And the dolphins are one of the most intelligent organisms on the planet besides humans. And so it's supposedly us, dolphins, elephants, and maybe chimps. That's kind of the order. And so they have these incredibly complicated brains, and part of it comes out of just having to process sonar, which is a skill we don't even understand how to process without a machine. So it's very, looking at brains, you can just kind of, when you're comparing between different species, you can definitely get a feel for how that species lives. People used to think if you looked at human brains and you just kind of felt where different bumps on the head were, you could figure out, oh, well, this person has a good memory because they have a bump on this part of the brain. That was called phrenology and is complete nonsense. So please do not think about that. But let's cut into the brain look a little more. So here's this cerebellum, this is the cerebrum, this is the corpus callosum that's connected the two sides of the brain. The hypothalamus is in this region. The pituitary, which actually comes off of the hypothalamus, is kind of the so if the hypothalamus collects all the information, the sensory information from the brain, the pituitary is the one that then says, oh, you need me to go talk to the adrenal glands? I'll talk to the adrenal glands. So they're kind of the messenger system. There was a case where a lot of times they find these strange things happening in neuroscience where there's a car accident, they go in to have an MRI, which is magnetic resonance imaging, and it looks at active parts of the brain. And this lady went in and she had a car accident. She wanted to make sure she didn't have brain damage, and she was missing this entire section of her brain. And they said, that's impossible. You need this to regulate your heartbeat and to stand upright and to digest your food. And she was 34 and she said, well, I seem to be doing just fine. What the hell? And it turns out somehow she never developed this part of the brain, but other parts of the brain compensated. And the brain does that so many times. That's why brain surgery is so complicated, because so many other parts of the brain will compensate when a certain part of the brain fails or it develops in a different way. There was another case where a woman, same thing, she went in, she was in a car accident, she went in to have an MRI, and they found a weird lump kind of in this region. This is a ventricle, and we'll talk about it. It's usually just filled with cerebral spinal fluid, but they found a lump, and they were like, oh no, it's a tumor, we have to get in there and take it out, and they excised it, and it turned out to be an unborn twin. So when this woman was developing in the womb, she had a twin, and part of her started developing around her unborn twin and just kind of encapsulated that twin inside of her own brain. And the lady thought it was hilarious. She's like, oh, that's where all my evil thoughts come from. And she was a neuroscientist as a result of that. So the brain is so strange, you guys. It's amazing. Let's talk about some parts. So if I were studying for a test and wondered what parts of the brain should I make sure I understand, these would be the ones. So the pons takes care of a lot of the visceral functions. So that's your guts, making sure everything is functioning the way it's supposed to, make sure that the heart is beating, make sure that you're breathing properly. Same thing with the medulla and the cerebellum. These things, the cerebellum especially, is involved in movement and coordination, which is really complicated, especially for humans walking on two legs. So while the pons and the medulla are taking care of a lot of very basic things like heartbeat, breathing, digestion, the cerebellum is taking care of balance. Okay. The thalamus, which is kind of in this general region, is one of those things that is taking in sensory information and sending it to different parts of the brain. Like it'll take in something it's heard, or like it just kind of go with that. It takes in sensory information and sends it away. One of the places it sends is to the hypothalamus, which is this general region of the brain. And so it takes in all the sensory information, like stuff you're smelling, the amount of light coming in, what kind of stuff you're feeling, either just like by touching it or just in general. And it says, hey, it's time to do something with it. And the hypothalamus is the one that controls the rest of the body through hormones. And so it's kind of this central controlling organ. For a long time, people thought the pituitary was the controlling organ because they noticed it would go and send signals to the adrenal gland, the testes, the ovaries, the uterus, everything. But it turns out the pituitary gland cannot function without the hypothalamus gland telling it what to do. So really, it's the hypothalamus that is that central hormone control gland. Let's see what else is super important. The limbic system so this prefrontal cortex that we talked about controls the limbic system. Your limbic system is your emotions and expressions, so that's an important thing to remember. The cerebrum as a whole, there's a lot of different things happening. This is interpretation of different input. It could be what you hear, what you smell, what you see. It is involved with voluntary movement, memory, reasoning, and personality. So there's a lot of stuff happening with this just kind of big, lumpy, squishy thing. And again, the corpus callosum, this part, is what connects the two sides of the brain. We could go into left brain versus right brain, but there's so much conflicting research that we're just not going to. Okay, so we can go into the cerebrum a little bit more by talking about what the occipital lobe, parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, this whole thing, and the temporal lobe do. I think I took out the cerebral spine. Anyway, so these things, so you'll notice these are the same names that we see in the skull parts and in the muscles. So it's you know that the occipital lobe is covered by the occipital bone. You know that the occipital bone is then covered by the occipital muscle, okay? There is no parietal muscle. This is all aponeuroses, but there is a parietal bone, and there's a frontal bone, and then a frontal muscle. There's also a temporal muscle that sits on top of the temporal bone, which is sitting on top of the temporal lobe. Yeah, it's a nice, it's anatomists trying to make it easier to remember things. But what do? So the frontal lobe deals with higher functions and voluntary motion. So higher functions being really deep thinking processes, algebra, reading a really intense book, interpreting emotional responses, all these things that make us thinking organisms, okay? The occipital lobe at the back deals with vision, which is really strange. Our eyeballs are way up here, but the neuron that deals with that, the optic nerve, actually zaps all the way back to the occipital lobe in order to process vision. Whatever, it doesn't not work, so evolution said it's okay. The parietal lobes deal with speech processing and skin sensation, two very different things, but whatever. And actually, we're going to see that so the temporal is all about hearing, which makes sense because this actually does make sense. The ears are here, so the temporal lobe can deal with hearing very close by. The fact that the occipital lobe is so far from the eyes is just a very strange thing. And then we can't see it here, but the insula, which is inside of all of this, deals with memory and visceral pain. So visceral pain is like very deep, intense pain, and that's something that your brain and your neurons remember. There's actually a chemical that comes out, it's an enkephalon, that says, remember that thing? Remember how much it hurt when you stepped on that Lego? Or when this very horrible thing happened? Never do it again. And so this pain can be the memory of pain can be so incredibly painful that it can almost make you feel like you're going through the same pain again. And the idea is that your brain's like, don't hurt yourself by doing the thing. Don't cause bodily pain. And in order to make sure you don't hurt yourself that badly, it makes you feel like you're going through the same pain again. It's whatever. Thank you, brain, for making us feel horrible. Okay, so interestingly, the brain, so one of the things that makes us human is processing language, right? And so it's really interesting if you do an MRI and you are watching a brain light up when different things are happening, when you're reading, so let's see, how is this? So this is the forebrain, this is the front of the brain. When you're reading words, you're looking at them, so the occipital lobe lights up. If you're hearing, the temporal lobe lights up. Those things make sense. But when you're thinking about words, your prefrontal cortex lights up. And when you're saying words, the insula and maybe a bit of the parietal starts lighting up. So it's very weird that language is spread out throughout the entire brain. And so I think about this kind of thing a lot when I think I can picture exactly what I want, like where on a page that thing I want to say is. Or when I was in college and I was taking a test, I'd be like, I know that I saw the definition for this word on this certain page. Why can't I remember that word? Well, it's because it's an entirely different part of the brain that was seeing it versus what was remembering it and thinking about it and then saying it or writing it. So, totally different parts of the brain. I could go on for literally hours about the brain, but this is all you need to know for this course. I highly recommend if you're interested in going and looking into more neurobiology. But for now, that's all, and I will see you next time. Bye.